Oh, it's 1 o'clock. Time flies. So, good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. I'm Marlene Saucier, and I'm Senior Director of Talent Networks and Partner Success here at TTA. As we evaluate ideas for webinars and content that we share with you all, our goal is to always make sure that the content is relevant and timely, as your time is so valuable, especially now. Mental health and stress management is a topic that we take very seriously here at TTA, and we're excited to introduce to you our friends from Total Brain, who will be speaking about mental health in the wake of the COVID-19 crisis. Here to share with you today is the CEO of Total Brain, Louis Gagnon. Louis is the CEO, as I mentioned, and he's a mental health and brain performance self-monitoring Total Brain is a mental health and brain performance self-monitoring and self-care platform. He's advisor to TPG Capital, a top-tier U.S. private equity firm who named him CEO of Ride, a portfolio company that he restructured. As a corporate executive, Louis held dual Chief Product Officer and Chief Marketing Officer roles at Audible by Amazon, Yodel, and Monster Worldwide. As an entrepreneur, Louis created and led 5 business and social enterprises on 4 continents, many of which were in the field of reproductive health. He received a Bachelor of Business Administration from Laval University in Quebec City and a Master's of Science in Marketing from HEC Montreal. His career has been awarded by his alma maters, and his work has been featured in a number of management books and magazines, including The Economist. Molly Lombardi is the founder of M.Dot Research and has written and spoken around the world on issues such as leadership development, employee engagement, workforce management, payroll, and workplace culture. As a researcher, writer, speaker, and consultant, Molly has spent thousands of hours working with and studying business leaders, employees, and technology executives. She understands how the best of the best bring people, strategy, and tools together to execute with excellence and achieve audacious success. I like that. Before we get started, I just wanted to make a couple of quick announcements about our session today. We will be recording this session and sending it out at the end of the webinar, along with a copy of the slides. And if you'll notice at the bottom of your screen, there is a Q&A feature there. Feel free to ask any questions that you might see, that you might have. And if you do see a question that you relate to, we do encourage you to click the little like or thumbs up button, because that will actually move that question farther up the line. So thanks again for joining us, and take it away, Louis and Molly.
Thank you so much, Marlene. It is a great pleasure to be with you all today. Molly, it's a great pleasure to see you again.
You as well.
And so wherever you are in the time zone, I wish you a great morning or afternoon. It is a pleasure for me to be here today because as Marlene mentioned, this particular time in our history is extremely rich with issues and therefore opportunities. The issue and opportunity that I've decided to devote my life to relates to a crisis that is the mental health crisis. So why do we call this a crisis? What is the mental health crisis? There is 20% of US workers who suffer from a mental condition like addiction or depression. 52% of us are at risk of getting a condition, which means that 20 plus 52, 72% of all of us are somewhat incapacitated, somewhat not at our best, somewhat not the best father, the best sibling, the best professional, the best friend that we can be, because our brain is slightly impaired and we are not accessing the full capacity that we have. And that is really the big issue that the mental health crisis brings, is we are not living our lives fully. But by the way, this is not a problem that is exclusive to a period of time or exclusive to a group of people. Mental health is a continuum. We get from being super able, super capable to not so much. And that continuum is something we need to accept and we need to simply address individually and collectively. What do we do at Total Brain given this challenge, given this problem? Our mission is to help individuals first manage their mental health risk. We give them an app that allows them to understand their risk and understand their brain capacity so that they can improve both, reduce the risk and improve their capacity. And I'll explain what I mean by brain capacity in a minute. From an organization's point of view that could sponsor our app for their employees, and you can see the logo form at the bottom of the screen of the kind of companies we're working with. Those organizations, when people take care of themselves, improve the health outcomes, reduce their healthcare costs, improve the productivity, and improve what I call the learning operating system. When the brain works, everything works. You can learn soft, hard skills, but who's going to actually take care of the operating system of that learning system is where we're coming from an L&D standpoint. And we have many, many great examples of how useful that can be from an L&D point of view. So individual organizations find what they want at Total Brain from a mental health point of view. Today, I would like to just quickly touch on what are those brain capacities, what is our model, what do we believe is mental health, and why does it matter? We're going to introduce you to an index that's called the Mental Health Index, Workers Edition, that we have launched and we just published for the second month yesterday, together with One Mind at Work and the National Alliance for Healthcare Purchasers Coalition, two big organizations, as you know, in the enterprise space. And together we're trying to raise awareness on how mental health is defined and how it is evolving in this very challenging time that this country and the rest of the world is going through. We're going to show you a little demo of an app that is the Total Brain app that can be used to address the issues that we see arising, and we'll also show how it looks from an employer point of view. So let's start with the basics. What is mental health? For most of us, we hear mental health and we think depression, anxiety, autism, ADHD. We hear problem because we, by political correctness, have tried to replace the word illness by health and thinking that it would be easier to talk about, which it is. The problem is it's a little confusing. Mental health is actually mental health. It is about capacity. It is about the capacity of one's brain. And there are 4 key capacities that we have that make us perform as human beings. The first one is emotions. We have emotions that come to us non-consciously. They just happen as life unfolds in front of us. I feel something. I don't control that. It just happened. That emotion can be positive or negative, and I'm going to feel it in my body in terms of anxiety, stress, and depressive mood. And if I have none of those things, I'm feeling great. And if that emotion is dragging me towards anxiety or stress, I'm going to feel it that way. So from a neuroscience point of view, emotions and feelings are defined that way. These 2 things will affect my capacity to think, my memory, what I can remember, what I can plan, how much I can focus. And it will also affect my self-control, my capacity to control myself in the universe, how I connect to people, and how resilient I am. So 4 key groups of capacities is what makes us capable. From a brain point of view, mental health is all of those things working fine. Now, the problem is that those capacities are constantly impaired. They're impaired by two things: our fight-flight response and or sub or clinical conditions like anxiety, depression, etc. A few things about those two things. The fight-flight response is our involuntary response. It's our nervous system that takes over when something happens in front of us. We have an emotion. Our system is going to go both ways. It's either going negative, you are being threatened and you should protect yourself, that is fight or flight, or it's going the other way, which is going to activate our vagal nerve, where we're going to instead be very flexible and open and collaborative. The fight-flight response is an extraordinary mechanism to survive, but it is not the most adapted way to survive psychological threat. It was great in the physical threat world, but in the psychological threat world, not so good. Why? Because it's basically telling our brain to be hyper-focused, to stop thinking, to stop collaborating, and to just focus on the task at hand, which is get some blood into those muscles and get into the fight and get your whole body to mobilize for something physical. So fight-flight is an issue that affects all of the emotions, feeling, cognition, self-control. And for anyone who's experienced a mental condition, either subclinically or clinically, we all know that if we're depressed, we're not thinking as much or the same way. We tend to be much more negative. If we're anxious, we seem to have more problems with focus, et cetera, et cetera. What is unique about mental health is that what drives those two things is pretty much out of our control. Why? Well, fight-flight is an involuntary response to an involuntary event. It's happening, and then you react, want it or not. And the subclinical or clinical conditions, again, is very much driven by an event or by genetic predisposition or by social determinants, which all contributed to make us more vulnerable or predisposed to move in a more dramatic way as we feel our emotions. So this uncontrollable event thing is being demonstrated right now like ever in history by the COVID crisis. And to make sure that we would track the impact that this life event has on our lives, we've decided to join forces with One Mind at Work and the National Alliance to create an index where we would use the assessments that our people, the employees of our employers are filling on a weekly basis. We have thousands of them, all walks of life, all places in the country, all sorts of industries. We randomly select 500, we control for statistical bias, and then we look at the results on a weekly basis, which gives us a sense of how we're impacted by events that happen during that time. So that is what I'm going to walk you through. And I'm going to stop from time to time, have a little discussion with Molly to try and understand the meaning of those things and have a chat about the impact that life seems to have on our very health, which is driving our capacity to be and to perform at work and at home. So the first risk that we're going to look at from a mental health point of view is general anxiety disorder. You can see here that in February, when we started, there was no COVID. And then in March, COVID started to become a thing. Mid-March, April, it became a real thing. And in May, it plateaued and started to diminish in certain places. And we have seen some sort of a recovery from a going back to normal standpoint. So what happens to our
new normal, right, Louis? A new normal that's much higher than it had been.
And that's it. So what we're seeing is even at the end of May, we're 91% higher from a risk point of view to be anxious. Molly, what do you think of that?
I mean, it feels right just in terms of all of us, I think, in our bones and in ourselves and in our family members and our colleagues are feeling this general anxiety. So I think you're right. People may have adapted to a new level of it, but it's so much higher than it was before. So I think that's again, it might be leveling off, but it's at a heightened state, which is, again, that fight or flight, that ability to respond is diminished because you're in this sort of constant state of anxiety, or you're at risk of being in a state of anxiety, which is
Correct.
frightening.
And the big news, the good news we're all waiting for is to see a real drop that's going to bring us back to February levels. But at the end of May, as we all know, George Floyd killing happened, and I believe we're going to see, and you can see in those charts that the last week of May is not going down in most cases. Look at it from a depressive disorder. So the risk of having depression is up the last week of May significantly, 163% higher than February. Molly, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something too that's being, because of not only the COVID crisis, but also the worldwide now sort of social upheaval we're seeing with George, got spurred on, got spurred on for hundreds of years, but sort of got reignited with the death of George Floyd in America. Again, this feels sort of instinctively right, even as scary as it is, that you feel, I and you and all of us feel more at risk. It doesn't necessarily mean that we are more depressed, but this specific number doesn't. But it means we're more at risk because I think we're all feeling a little closer to the edge than we were before.
Yeah.
With all these things.
And just so that people understand the notion of risk, it's not a binary thing. We calculate the risk of depression by using a tool that you may be aware of called PHQ-9 or PHQ-2, which are a series of standardized questions such as, do you feel blue? Do you feel hopeless? Things like that. And you have a scale from 1 to 5. And if you cross a certain level in the scale, you are considered at risk. And if you are below that scale, we say you're okay. Being at risk means you said that you were fairly blue. Whether or not that translates into a clinical diagnostic, that the risk means that you have a problem to address. You are being impaired somewhat, and I think this is something to remember.
I think it's also important to remember that because the risk can be controlled by the things that you can do, which is exactly what we're going to talk about later today. It's important to understand the risk, not just because oh, well, it's really unfortunate, but it's identifying the risk so that we can do something about it to say, because different people, we all know different people who've gone through tons of stress and have been through major life events and all of that, who handle it well and seem to thrive, and other people who tend to have moments where they would fall apart or might be diagnosed temporarily with a clinical depression or anxiety disorder. But I think it's important to understand the risk means you still have an opportunity, and you always have an opportunity to sort of do the self-work to help you come out on either side of that. So I think it's important to remember about risk as well. And we'll be talking about what you can do if you do find yourself at risk.
100%. Look at PTSD, up 73%. For a lot of people, including my wife, who's a frontline worker, this is traumatic. COVID in the New York area was very traumatic. I can still hear it from my wife's voice every day. And so we have been traumatized, and we need to be aware that there is something to be done, to Molly's point.
Yeah.
Social anxiety disorder, which is a type of anxiety that relates to our relationship and our capacity to be with other people, that has gone up 55% from a risk point of view. Look at the end of May again, there seems to be something, and we hope I can't wait to see what happens in June after all of these protests and all of these marches have unfolded. But it's an interesting one to watch in the social context we're in.
I think it's interesting too that it kind of seemed to dip a little bit in March, not dipping below the February 3 levels, but dip a little. I think part of that was because people were staying home, right? And so they were in their bubble. But I think now, even though people are at home because of COVID, our bubble is getting burst a bit with all the other things going on in the world. So I think it'll be interesting. Like you said, it'll be interesting to see where that goes.
Yeah, that makes sense. Addiction, we had a significant increase. We were up a lot more in April. It slowed down a little bit in May, but we're still 25% above the normal risk. Molly, any
Yeah, I
comments?
mean, it's just sort of anecdotally. I mean, there's a liquor store near us that we know the owner of, and my husband was chatting with them the other day, and they said that he's selling 4 to 5 times as much alcohol as he did the same time last year.
Wow.
So, I mean, that doesn't mean everyone who buys a bottle of wine is an addict, but it just goes to show you that people are at home, and there's going to be a lot of addiction to deal with when people sort of start getting out and getting help again.
Yeah. And then we have sleep apnea that we track as a risk that we would not expect to move during, because not influenced by external events so much as physical events. And that is how mental conditions seem to have moved since February with all of the overlay that we can make and do on COVID. Now, our key thesis here is to say, well, this and fight flight affects our brain capacity. Did it? So we're going to go back to all of the markers of all of those things I told you before, and we're going to see if there was an impact. That's okay with you, Molly?
Yep. I'll just say one thing about sleep apnea. I think one of the things to think about there is sleep apnea, if you're not familiar with it, it's a very disruptive disorder. You may not feel that you're waking up, but you wake up multiple times during the night. You don't get a lot of solid sleep. Anyone who's ever had a child or been ill or anything like that or spent a night at a hospital knows not getting sleep even for a day or two can make you feel bad. This is people who are chronically not able to get deep sleep, which can impact every other part. So I think even though it sounds like it's a little bit different than some of the other items on this page, I think it's important to remember it's an underlying condition that can really make it very difficult to keep on the good side of the risk for all these other conditions too.
And I have personally been diagnosed with this about a month ago, and
yeah.
I was waking up 24 times an hour.
Yeah.
And so, you know, unconscious that it was what made me so tired in the morning, but, you know, it's a big deal. Okay, emotional capacities. So it all starts with emotion, yeah?
Before we move on from the previous slide, Jacqueline just had a quick question. She wanted to know if the y-axis on the graphs have the same increments.
Yes, so they all have different scale. This is just a visual representation. So the increments is very much varying. One would be percentages of prevalence. Like, for example, the distance between this and this for general anxiety, dependent on the scale, might be different than the one that we see in sleep apnea. So
but the full details are in the report, right? Is that, yeah.
The goal of the graph is just to talk about the trend, and everything is with all of the x-axis and all of the details on the scale themselves is available in our document that you can access after the presentation. Make sense? So moving on to the emotional capacities. There's two big capacities, emotionally speaking, that we can get trained and improved upon. One is our capacity to recognize emotions. It's called emotional awareness. This is how I read emotional cues in others, so that when I connect with someone, we're in sync. I know if you're angry, I know if you're in love, I can adjust my communication based on what I receive from you. Super important. This has been going up and down since the beginning of February. There is right now no significant difference statistically between where we are and where we were. And that is nice because this is something that drives our capacity to build relationship and to trust.
It'll be interesting to see where this goes in June, you know, with all those social protests. But I also think it's interesting the amplitude of that wave, sort of the height and lows of it were very extreme in February and March and seem to be evening a little, but it'll be interesting to see where that goes.
Yeah.
This is where data geeks like me have a really good time with this stuff.
Yes. Non-conscious negativity. This is how negative we are non-consciously. Are we wired by default on the negative side is what this measures. you can see that there was a significant increase starting April. It came down a little bit in May. This is usually highly correlated with depressive mood and with depression. When we are depressed, we tend to be much more negative than usual. And so this non-conscious negativity would be something that is now rising particularly faster with elderlies, older people who unconsciously are reminded that what's happening is really a crisis. And so when we look at the data by age, we see that older people are much more affected. But this is, again, something that is super interesting in terms of how we cope.
And Louis, I just had a question that I've never asked you before, but what's the time period when you talk about past experiences? Is it recent past? Is it distant past? Or is it both?
Unlimited.
Okay.
It's
So we might see in a month or two, we might see the impact of experiences within the last few months, right?
Yes. And so what we see when we look at the data from an age group point of view is people who are old enough to have seen, to have heard or experienced as a child the Great Depression are much more negative unconsciously than others.
Gotcha. Interesting.
And that is super important because it drives our flexibility and our creativity. If I am like coming into something with this negative energy, well, we all know what that looks like, and in a work environment, that's not always pretty. That's for emotion. So those emotions are triggering our feelings and our capacity to control those feelings. We're talking about stress. Compared to the beginning of February, that stress is up 28%. Stress is about threats, is how much of a threat do I perceive in any situation? My brain is wired to avoid threats and to look for rewards, to look for safety first. That drives our performance, the stress, because sometimes it accelerates our movements, our mobilizations, our thinking. It also can burn us out if we have too much of it. And so the fact that it is rising like this significantly in this time for all the reasons that we all know is definitely something to watch. Molly, your experience of stress as an indicator of performance at work, what would you say that does?
Well, I think you're right. It can go both ways. It's about not only the stress to perform, because sometimes that can be good because people are counting on you, but also then it does become exhausting. I think a lot of people have found that at home, you know, oh, they get so much work done because they're not commuting, or they have these big lists of things they wanted to accomplish. And I think it's good to have some pressure on yourself to perform, but when you try to do so much and not give yourself enough room to actually breathe around some of those tasks is when the stress levels seem to be, again, sort of plateauing maybe a little bit, but at a much higher level than they had been before.
In my own life, when I see that stress is unhealthy when I am obsessive about the thing I want to achieve.
Yeah.
So that's a big one. Anxiety is up 47%. Our capacity to control that anxiety is going down. This is how fearful we are versus the future. It drives our aversion to risk. If we are scared, we're not going to be prone to take risk. And again, super important. Depressive mood, same direction as the disorder itself. Now that's at the feeling level. It's non-clinical. This is a normal thing to have, but right. You can see that again, it's rising significantly.
I think it's important to remind people, again, this is not depression as in the clinical depression, as you said, but also these are the components. We talk about feeling control. These are the components that go into that capacity. So I think it's important for people to remember that these are the things you can try and work on. And obviously anxiety and depression going hand in hand isn't surprising. I figured you said this quote, but I'm going to paraphrase it badly, but basically they were saying the reason to live in the moment is if you're living in the future, you're living in anxiety. If you're living in the past, you're living in depression, right? So that's why if you you are feeling some of these risks, being in the moment. I also love that because people have told me in the past, be in the moment, be in the moment. I'm like, well, what does that mean? Why should I be in the moment? And when I heard that, it made so much sense, because if you're living in the future, you're worried about what may happen next. If you're living in the past, wishing things were the way they were, you could be living in depression. So one of the ways that people are dealing with this, and we'll talk about, is to be able to try and be in the moment. So I know we're going to talk about that later, but that's so important to understand, I think, for people too.
100% agree. So we have an emotion. Tension is our negativity is going up a little bit. Our feelings of those things is going up significantly. And now, how does that affect our cognition? Well, our memory has not yet been affected. Memories would be something that is affected in the long range when we've been under a condition or under stress for a long period of time. So we're not too surprised to see that sort of random variability. This is this is good news, and we hope we maintain that. On the focus front, our capacity to not make mistakes when we give people tasks has gone down 32%. And that is very much a concern from a productivity point of view. People are distracted. There's 1,000 things to think about. You're working while the kids are doing the homework, and there's dinner to prepare, and camp has been canceled. It's really hard to keep our focus, and we can see it a little bit in this data. Molly, any comments on focus?
Yeah, again, this sort of feels right? We've all had that experience, like you can't remember what you did all day, but you know you're exhausted. You know, and you had 15 things to do that you didn't get done. You can't figure out why, but you just know that you didn't have the capacity, you know, the brain power, the willpower to do it. And I think this can be really hard for people, because I think if you force it, that can cause some other stresses on yourself. But it's sort of, how do we find ways to focus within this chaos that we're all kind of living in?
Planning, our capacity to make decisions and take all sorts of information into consideration, which drives strategy, capacity to make strategic decisions, is down 8%. So conditions affect our emotions a little bit, affects our feelings, certainly affects our cognition from a focus and planning point of view to start with. And then there is what we call self-control, our social connectivity. That went up significantly at the beginning of COVID, when everybody rushed to Zoom and to Skype to call their old friends and family. And we can see that this is wearing off a little bit, and the connectivity is going back to where it used to be pre-COVID. Molly, any comments on that one?
I just think that's one we need to watch, because I think we need to be aware of the decline, so that we keep up the benefits of social connectivity without the wearing and the wearing out and the weariness of it, the burnout on social connectivity. We keep the good parts of that, because I think that can be dangerous, especially if we see a drop off before people really are out of the house again. I think it could be difficult, for putting a lot more people at risk if they lose that.
Resilience, our capacity to bounce back, has gone down about 4% based on February analysis. That's where you see that the gradation of the scale varies from one graph to the other, because 4% here looks much bigger. But that's because the increment between each line is much smaller than on others. But here is the graph, and that resilience drives our stamina. It's important to have it and to not let that go down. Our conscious negativity, how negative we are consciously, drives collaboration. That negativity is up again 23%, which is significant. So all of this is going a long way to show that, yes, life happens and life affects us all, and it affects not only our risk, but it affects our capacities very concretely. So what can we do about it is really the question. At Total Brain, we've built an app which allows people to self-monitor and self-care. Self is super important in this moment in history, because you don't want to go to the hospital. You are at home. You have the time to do stuff for yourself. And so being self-sufficient becomes super important and economically viable. What do you monitor and what do you care for? The 12 capacities we just looked at, the fight or flight response that you may or may not be having, and the 7 mental conditions. You can do it all in about 20 minutes, once a month, or whenever you want. And what you get is a report where we're going to show you your strength and your weakness in relations to people, your age, your gender, and your level of education. And I'm going to get into this in a minute. The highlight here is to say, look, I don't control COVID. I don't control what happens in life, but I do control how aware I am on the impact that this has on me. And I do control how I react to it. And so we are part of that construct, if you like, of self-empowerment in mental health and well-being, where we want people to do something for themselves, knowing with data why they should be doing it and is it working or not. So that,
and Louis, I think that part about self too is so important, because it's, even though you do offer comparisons for people against their age group or other people in their company or whatever, it's not about scoring you as an individual against people. It's about everyone being able to improve from where they are to where they're going. It's like any other number we look at in the quantified self. People are counting their steps, they're counting their weight, they're counting their calories, all these things. It's not about someone else's score. It's about giving you things that help you improve no matter where you are.
Exactly. And so the assessment is a bunch of tasks. They're neuroscientific tests that were validated. We have 7 or 10 publications for all of our assessments, proving that they are valid and reliable from a neuroscience point of view. In 20 minutes, you measure all of the markers of emotions, cognition, and the mental health risk. In the end, we give a summary. This is my strength, my weaknesses. I can see them all in one graph. And then when I swipe to the right, I can see my highest capacity. I can see the trend against last month, and I can dig in and go understand what is resilience exactly and how useful is it and why do I have to improve that capacity. So that is on the self-monitoring part.
I think too, as leaders, it's very important to understand it's not just about understanding your employees, it's about understanding yourself too. It's not about, I want to find out how A, B, and C people on my team are performing. It's really about, what do I know about myself that helps me communicate with them better, or be productive with them better.
Correct. It's about my brain, right? It's about understanding what operates me, what makes me perform in life. At the end of it all, we're going to suggest a program. The program will change every day, and it will try to address 2 things: get you to work on your strength first and your weakness second, so that your brain gets some reward and some dopamine and feel good because they're really good at something. And then we're going to get you to work on areas where you could improve in relations to yourself. And so you see the training has a little tag for which one of the capacity that this thing is working on. You have a little introduction. We give you 2 types of training: brain training and mind training. Brain training is something like this, where you need to recognize happy faces in a sea of negativity. And when you do that, you rewire the brain in a positive manner. We have also mind training, which is about breathing and meditation to calm the mind down, get you to your center, and get you to realize that the moment is all that you have, and you should be present, to Molly's point earlier. So that is for capacities. If I am in learning and development mode and I have teams who I want them to learn, if I'm integrating 2 banks and I need for people to come together in the right way, giving them a tool where they can assess their readiness to change and work on their capacity to change and integrate is very much aligned with what this app is proposing here. Then we self-monitor the brain states. What is that? We said it's about fight-flight response. We have an association with the American Heart Association where we can, we have developed the science to look at your heart rate variability through the camera of your phone. And by doing so, we're able to see if you're in fight or flight, or if you're not, what is the optimal level of stress compared to you. And if we see that you're right now in fight or flight, you're not in the flexible state, we're going to get you to do a little exercise to bring you in a more flexible state. And one of those exercises is something like this. This is an app that's called My Calm Beat, where we get people to breathe a certain number of breaths per minute. The magic number is 6. And if you do that for 3 minutes, you shut off your fight flight and you get into a flexible and calm zone. Let's take 30 seconds to just feel what that feels like. And maybe we can just take the moment to take stock of what's happening in the present. So when we breathe at that rate, we slow down our metabolism and we get into a different state of mind, a different brain state that is now allowing us to use our brain to think, to love, to collaborate, which is otherwise much harder to do when we're all focused on fighting or running away from a situation. And I know that, Molly, you've had a particular experience with this tool. Would you mind sharing with us?
Yeah, absolutely. Part of the reason, I came to know Total Brain as part of my looking at HR technology and how companies are using technology, but then I had a very personal experience with it. When I met Louis and his partner, Evian, I had the privilege of working with Evian for about a month. He did some coaching with me, and I learned this breathing exercise. And last October, I had brain surgery for Parkinson's disease, which I was diagnosed with about 7 years ago. And during that surgery, not only was it brain surgery, but I had to be awake because they want to make sure they're not messing anything up anymore. And so I had this experience with the breathing, and I used that breathing throughout all the testing I had to do for the procedure. And then when I was awake during the procedure, I was in the pre-op room, and they had to take me down. I had to actually wait in a hallway for half an hour because there was someone in the MRI machine, and then I'd have an MRI while I was awake. I had a big cager on my head, and then they did the surgery. They actually drilled through my skull while I was awake, and it didn't hurt, but I was able to, they could give me local painkillers, but they couldn't sedate me because I wanted to be able to have the reactions. And I was able to breathe through it. I remember at one point when I was waiting in the hallway, the doctor saying to me, "How are you doing?" And I said, "I'm actually amazed at how well I'm doing." They're like, "We are too." But it was about that breathing, and it's amazing to this day, whether it's something I do consciously in the morning as part of a practice to kind of start my day, or there's a moment in the day where I find myself being literally inflexible. With Parkinson's or even just with tension. I love the word flexibility because it's about the mental state, but it's also about your physical state. You want your arteries to be pliable. You want your body to be pliable. That's one of the things that makes you able to be open to things. And the idea of, I find myself during the day, if my shoulders are up around my ears, taking that moment to even just breathe for a minute, that at the 6 breaths per minute, it's amazing how transformative that can be. It's been transformative for me. And people wonder if they're doing it right or if they don't have the app. That part doesn't matter. It's great to have the app, but it's also even just being conscious of that breath and finding a way to bring yourself into the moment can be so, so powerful. Literally, through being awake through brain surgery, I was able to breathe through it, and it kept me calm. And so it's just amazing to see. When you think about it, taking that into all the parts of your life, I think it can be really, really powerful.
Molly, this is the second time that you share this. She surprised me with that sharing in another webinar maybe a month ago. And I did not tell you, but I will tell you now that this is the reason why we do what we do. And if it was only for you, my friend,
No,
this
thank
was
you.
worth it. I was so touched that you shared this, and I'm very humbled to hear that you're taking this in your life as a practice, app aside and business aside.
Right.
It's super important.
And that's why I wanted to be on call, because obviously, there's my research perspective, but also as a person, whether it's you or anything else, it's like this ability to share the story of there's a way to be present. And so I think it's also, again, to be flexible, to be present, to be in that moment, because we are all at risk at all times of getting into a state of fight or flight. And so it's how we're able to control that, I think, is really powerful. And it's amazing how often I use it, whether I could be sitting in the car, I could be at home, I could be watching the news, and it gets to be too much, taking that moment to get flexible again, I think is so important.
Thank you so much for your
Thank you.
testimonial. So we also monitor, screen, and refer when people are at risk. We get people, when we do see a risk, we give a list of symptoms that we suspect that person might have. That person validates those symptoms or not, and based on her or his own judgment of how impaired they feel they are, they can accept or not recommendations that we make to go see a medical doctor. All of those screening tools are, again, published scientific tools that are well known, and we did not invent them. They are 70 to 80% accurate. So,
and two things, just, I know we're running out of time, but two things here that I want to emphasize is this is all driven by the user, and so it meets them at the time that they're willing to seek help. We all know people that may need some of this help, but it's very difficult to get it to accept it if you're not in a place to be hearing about it. So not only does it deliver that referral at the moment when they're open to it, it also, because it's through a third party, it's not like it's telling your boss, by the way, so-and-so called their doctor about, depression, anxiety, and sleep apnea, but so it allows them to have that self moment to be able to either address that risk or whatever they need to do at the moment when they're going to be willing to accept that kind of help.
And that, Molly, is the only way that we found to break the stigma around mental health. I don't need to talk to my boss. I don't need anyone to know. It's me against me in front of my screen. It's my data. Nobody will ever see this. This is 100% confidential. And now I ponder for myself and decide what I want to do, if the risk is significant or not. One thing to note is, as we said, emotion is normal. Having a depressive mood is normal. What's the difference between sad and depressed? Like, who's to know?
Yeah.
Well, this tool tells you. If we say you're at risk, it's telling you that maybe you're more than sad and maybe you should do something. And that is addressing the biggest problem in mental health, which is that half of us go to work sick every day.
Yeah.
Half of the people who have a condition, not half of us, but half of the 20%, and that's huge.
And I think too, again, because it's about you're going to work and all these things, it is about your ability to make that change, because no one can make it for you. And it's this ability to say, it's me against myself, so I have to make these decisions, and it's about the personal responsibility. And again, as a leader too, to be able to not only model this from we have the app point of view, but to be able to model it and have the ability to say, you don't have to share everything with your team, but to be able to say, as an individual, I've learned this about myself that I can bring back to being a better communicator, to being a better leader, I think is important too.
Yes, absolutely. So that is the app. Really quickly, you self-monitor, become aware, do something. In the do something, we have a lot of suggestions, but as Molly said before, if you want to go for a walk and what works for you is tennis or whatever it is, our goal is not to sell our means. We think that breathing meditation and brain training is super useful, but really our goal is to bring people to themselves, make them realize what they want, what they do. Does it work for them? You may just ignore the training and just do your own thing, but reassess yourself and see if that works. And if that works, that's perfect. We've reached our goal. So that is really the idea about Total Brain. Then we look at it in aggregate, totally confidential, and we can produce a report to an employer that looks like this, where we show the employer their brain health with their percentile score as a company. How do they rank against the US population? What is the movement quarter to quarter, year on year? How do they compare with our corporate benchmark as opposed to just the US population? We can do that at the capacity level. We can do that at the risk level and really dig down and say, hey, 61% of your population is at risk of a condition. And these are the conditions that we're seeing, and these are the trends. This sort of data is unprecedented. And what we believe it allows a company to do is to visualize at a high level the strength, the weaknesses, and the risk of the company or the group. Have benchmark, understand against the index, how am I doing, and get custom analytics by office locations, department, business units, so that we can actually understand the impact that our business has on our people, and we can do something about it at a policy level. If you want to do this, if you want to get information on COVID, if you want to see how you're doing against the index, we offer right now a 3-month corporate subscription. We started this at the beginning of COVID just to allow companies to see how they're doing, to get their people to try and get the help as it counts right now. After 3 months, if the company wants to continue, we will not say no, and we will hopefully get remunerated to do that. But this is not why we're doing this. We're really doing this to build a national benchmark, build the awareness, and help the people who can get the help right now, as it is important. So that concludes the formal part of the presentation. I think we're maybe 5 minutes too much, but I will now let Marlene maybe ask some Q&A.
Sure. Thank you so much, Louis and Molly. It was great hearing from you guys. So the first question we have, and interestingly, the most popular, is from Anna. She wanted to know, has anyone done the analysis to see if alcohol consumption has gone up, or did drinking just shift from being done in bars and restaurants to being done in the home?
So we don't have access to the general data on alcohol consumptions, but what we see is that addiction risk is significantly higher. And that is good for all addiction. It's cigarettes, it's alcohol, it's opioid, it's whatever people take to self-medicate and to control these anxiety and these depressive moods that they feel are out of control. So I would assume and bet that alcohol is up, but I don't have the number. Do you have it, Molly?
No, I don't. But it's one of those things you were talking earlier about how do you assess if a risk is is becoming problematic. And I know the AA definition is when it's interfering with your life, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I would say that for a lot of these conditions, that's why it's so important to be checking with yourself, because it may not be your level of drinking could be fine for you, but it's not an addiction, but it's a risk, and you can manage that. But it's also about how you can. It's also about how you can sort of as an individual assess whether that's working for you or not. So I think that may be something to keep in mind about all of these capacities as well. So, but I do, like I said, when it comes to sales, it's been very interesting because obviously, yeah, people aren't drinking at bars, but they, just that one anecdotal moment was sort of like 4 to 5 times as much home alcohol consumption. Seems like a lot.
Yes.
Oh, thank you. Emily has a question as well. She wants to know, how can learning and development functions support employees when we recognize from these findings that motivation may be low?
Yes, we need to put people back in touch with themselves, right? Motivation is not there because people are off their centered. When you're centered, you want to grow, you want to be a better self, you want to show the world the best version of you. when you're off, either because you're depressed, anxious, or you're at risk of such things, these considerations are disturbed. And the best way to bring people back is to put them back in touch with themselves. And so that's my short answer is self-awareness, and then do something to make yourself feel good so that you are entrepreneurial again and you want to do something again. Molly, would you agree?
Yeah, and I think too, part of it is that the language we use is so important. Talking to someone about their brain is very different than talking to someone about their mind. You know what I mean? So having something going on with your brain that you can fix or work on seems much less threatening than saying you have a mental illness, I think, to a lot of people. So I think some of it is helping give them these tools and contextualizing for them to say, listen, it's about you and your peak performance. How do we evaluate where you are and get you to top performance so that you can be curious and learn? I would argue all learning would have to have some of this ability to control your mood and your flexibility, because you don't want to improve yourself if you're stuck in all these other issues. So I think part of it is just to have the right make tools available, but also have the language to talk about it, such as, you know, make it non-threatening, make it not about we're trying to find out who's an alcoholic so we can fire you. You know, that's not what this is about. This is about giving you tools to self-reflect and be able to get to your level of peak performance.
And there will be three kinds of people at any point in time. The people who are surviving, they cannot do anything, they're just trying to get by. Then you have the people who are maintaining. They cannot take any more. Whatever they have is the max that they can do. And when you put those two groups together, you're like 80% of the population.
Yeah.
And then you have the people who are growth mindset orientated, who are willing and healthy, and they want to do more. That's usually 20%. So we have a lot of work to do on the other side.
And it's temporal. I think, you know, you're not permanently in one of those groups. You're always sliding back and forth. And
Right.
I've done some research in past lives that looked at if you stand by people and offer them tools to get them through the times when they're barely surviving, when they're in survival mode, when they are in productive mode, they will be more loyal and even more productive because you've stood by them and understood that they're going to be on a spectrum.
Correct.
Oh, that's great. Emily had a follow-up question to the last question. She wanted to know what would be some meaningful training and what would some meaningful training interventions look like?
Molly, I'll let you answer.
Well, I think some of it is if you have people like myself or others that are willing to share their own experiences, I think that's very, very powerful, because, and it's not that you want to have your managers talking about mental illness because you don't want them diagnosing people or things like that. But I think the more you can get people to say that they're using the tool, the more that you can help people understand what the use cases are, you know, whether it's using, you know, videos like what we've done today or things like that, help people understand the why behind it. Because again, it's not, you know, no boss could make me breathe better so I could get through a surgery, right? But it's something that I was able to do because of what I learned. And so I think that can be one of the ways to help people understand is, again, it's not going to be you can't make it a mandatory program for mental health, right? It's just, it's never going to work for people because people have to be open to accepting. But I think as long as you're continually making sure that something that you're bringing awareness to and bringing some light to, you know, that it's not, it shouldn't be scary for people, I think is going to be really important.
I have nothing to add.
Excellent. We have an anonymous attendee who has a question, and it's actually a great question. What about those of us who would like to do this in some way but don't belong to an organization? So independence.
Yes, come on our website. We have a link where you can ask for a free subscription and we'll give it to you.
Yeah.
So generous. Thank you.
They mean it when they say they want people to be better.
Excellent. I think it looks like we hit them all. So no, so thank you so much to you, Molly and Louis.
Absolutely.
Here you guys. Thanks so much, and thank you to all of you for joining us today. We hope you have a wonderful afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
All right, bye-bye.